Most people heard about the late war Japanese kamikaze planes, and some even know the purpose-built Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, the so-called Baka bomb, a rocket-powered kamikaze bomb built to be used against the Allied ships. If you don't know much about that Japanese design, I have already made a video on that, check it out on my channel. But there was a vehicle not as well known as the Japanese flying bomb, but built in Germany close to the end of the war, with similar purpose and design. This was the Fieseler Fi-103R Reichenberg. So let's see the history of this aircraft. The story of the Reichenberg starts way back in the early 1940s, when the Germans first experimented with the flying bomb, which then became the famous V1, the buzz bomb. Though its earliest roots go back even to 1935, when Paul Schmidt proposed a flying bomb using the Passjet engine to the Luftwaffe. The project was dismissed then because of the technical difficulties, but in the early 1940s it surfaced again, when Schmidt started working with the Argus company. Argus originally became interested in the unmanned and remote-controlled aircraft in the late 1930s, and with the lead of Fritz Goslau proposed their 292 and later the Fernfeuer design to the Luftwaffe in 1939. After these designs, they started cooperating in 1940 with Schmidt. Their goal was to create an efficient Passjet engine using the fuel injection from Argus and the shutter system Schmidt developed. The tests of the new engine on automobiles and later on aircraft proved its capabilities, and that it is a viable option to use on unmanned weapons. The first designs for the weapon, which later became the V1, were drawn up in early 1942, when Robert Lasser, a Fieseler engineer, visited Argus. He had a meeting with Goslau, where they proposed a cooperation to build a flying bomb. The plans were soon submitted to the Luftwaffe, and in June the same year, the design for the Fieseler Fi-103 was approved. The engine development and manufacturing was entrusted to Argus, the airframe production to Fieseler, while the work on the guidance system was given to the Ascania company. The first Fi-103 was completed in August 1942, and after a series of glide tests, the first powered flight happened in December the same year, and in May 1943 they went into production. The production was slow in the first year and only really picked up in 1944. But as the years passed by, the outlook of the war changed, from the German successes in the beginning to a fear of the Allied invasion in the West. And this was the time when the idea of the Fi-103R manned version surfaced. The main targets for these weapons would have been the Allied ships in case of an invasion, and the plan was to aim the aircraft towards the target before the pilot bails out with their parachute in the last possible moment. The chances of survival, however, were very slim for the pilots of these weapons, so they established a separate unit, the so-called Leonidas Squadron, where the volunteers signed a declaration that they fully understood what being part of the squadron means and that their missions will most likely cost them their lives. Initially, two vehicles were considered, one of them the modification of the Fieseler Fi-103, and the other the Messerschmitt Me-328. The 328 was designed as a compact, mostly wooden fighter, which can be manufactured cheaply. It was envisioned with several propulsion types, including jet engines, but the low numbers of those engines meant that they were used for more developed designs, such as the Messerschmitt Me-262 or the Arado 234. You can check my earlier videos if you're interested in the history of those planes. The Me-328 was tested with the Passjet engines, but soon it ran into problems. As the engines were extremely loud, they caused massive vibrations and uneven thrust, as it was impossible to synchronize the cycles on the two Passjet engines. The problems eventually led to the dropping of this type, and the attention turned towards modifying the Fi-103. Hitler tasked his favorite commando leader, Otto Skorzeny, to work out plans against the feared Allied invasion. This actually included not just manned flying bombs, but manned torpedoes as well, and the Germans developed several different types of those, alongside of mini-submarines as well. Don't be surprised, but I have a video on those as well. You can find it on the channel. Skorzeny actually pushed the idea of the Fi-103R for some time, but only after the Me-328 was finally dropped was this project considered seriously. The DFS, the same institute that worked on the famous Me-163 rocket fighter, was entrusted to modify the rocket with a cockpit and flight controls for a pilot. The design actually was very similar to the Japanese Oka, which we mentioned at the beginning, with a large warhead in the nose, a tiny, very rudimentary cockpit, and the engine behind the pilot. The F503R was 8 meters long, with a wingspan of just 5.72 meters. It weighed 2,250 kilograms and was powered by an Argus Pulse jet engine. It had a maximum speed of 800 kilometers an hour, though this was not limited by the engine, but rather the airframe, and the speed was set for the pilots as never to exceed. The cruise speed of the rocket was 650 kilometers an hour, and it had a range of 330 kilometers, or 32 minutes of flight time. Strangely enough, though we compared the Reichenberg to the Japanese Oka, there was another Japanese design which was actually very heavily based on the F503R. This was, or rather would have been, the Kawanishi Baika, which was designed but not built before the war ended. The cockpit of the F503R was added in the space where normally the compressed air cylinders were fitted, and the removal of the autopilot system freed up space for those to be moved at the back of the aircraft. This meant the cockpit was immediately in front of the engine air intake, so even though the plan was for the pilot to bail out, this would have been a very complicated and dangerous task. There was one big problem with the F503R project, however. By the time the first modified models were ready, the Allied invasion of France already took place, as the maiden flight of the Reichenberg only happened in September 1944. By this time there was no need for suicide weapons to attack Allied ships, and many felt the project was just a waste of resources. Most of the initial flights ended in crashes as well, until Hannah Rice herself started flying the type to figure out the problem. Eventually the reason for the crashes was identified as pilots trying to land at too low speeds, which is understandable as the original V1 was never designed for landing, just to impact at the end of its flight. During its short lifetime, the F503R had 5 different variants. The R1 was the single-seat unpowered glider for training. The R2 was a 2-man glider version. The R3 was a similar 2-seat but powered variant. The R4 was the standard 1-seat powered model, the one which would have been used for combat missions. And the R5 was used as a trainer for the HG-162 pilots. The type after its development had a very short history, which probably saved the life of many would-be pilots. As only a month after its first flight, in October 1944, when KG-200 received a new commander, Werner Bambach, the project was shelved in favor of the more ambitious Mistral project, which was basically an unmanned plane filled with explosives and piloted from a parasite fighter on its back. I have already mentioned this project in my earlier Ju-88 video, so if you're interested in the topic, check it out. The Reichenberg project was not cancelled yet. Testing and training of the pilots continued until February 1945. But not long after, in March, when during a test flight one of them lost both of the wings, killing the pilot, the project was cancelled for good. Bambach felt this venture went on long enough, and asked Albert Speer to help him convince Hitler to call it off, as suicide attacks are not part of the German warrior tradition. Hitler agreed, and the unit was disbanded the same day, and none of the converted rockets went into combat. The history of the German suicide rocket ended before it could have claimed any lives on the Allied side. Though the Fieseler Fi was just a short-lived, desperation-born suicide weapon, developed too late and produced in small numbers, it is still an interesting part of World War II. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.